Good day everyone. For today's video, we're going to talk about the borrowing cost. What is borrowing cost? Borrowing costs are interest and other costs that an entity incurs in connection with the borrowing of funds. Ito yung mga interest and other costs na mula sa inutang ng entity para sa pagpapakonstruct ng building or any project ay borrowing cost. Borrowing cost includes interest expense, calculated using the effective interest method, finance charges in respect to a finance leases, exchange differences arising from foreign currency borrowings to the extent that it is regarded as an adjustment to interest cost. Yan po yung tatlong included sa borrowing cost. Two simple steps in understanding borrowing cost. First, identify the qualifying assets, and last, accounting for borrowing cost from funds used for qualifying assets. What is qualifying asset? A qualifying asset is an asset that necessarily takes a substantial period of time to get ready for its intended use or sale. Ito yung mga assets na matagal bago gamitin. Examples nito ay inventories, manufacturing plants, power generation facilities, intangible assets, investments. Example naman ng non-qualifying assets ay financial assets and inventories manufactured or otherwise produced over a short period of time. Assets that are ready for their intended use or sale when acquired. Accounting for borrowing cost. First, if the borrowing is directly attributable to the acquisition, construction, or production of a qualifying asset, the borrowing cost is required to be capitalized as cost of the asset. Ika-capitalize ang borrowing cost if it is directly attributable sa ating qualifying asset. If hindi ito qualifying asset, automatically, we will not capitalize borrowing cost. Second, all other borrowing costs shall be expensed as incurred. Normally, ang interest ay expense talaga. So, bihira lang nakakapag-capitalize kapag ito ay directly attributable to the acquisition, construction, or production of a qualifying asset. And lastly, the amount of borrowing cost that an entity capitalized during a period shall not exceed the amount of borrowing cost it incurred during that period. Hindi tayo pwedeng mag-capitalize ng amount more than the actual na in-incurred during the period. So, ang limit lang is kung magkano lang talaga yung na-incurred mo during the period. Now, let's proceed to the funds used for qualifying assets. Meron tayong two types of borrowing cost. Una, specific borrowing. Specific borrowing may be invested temporarily which arises interest income. The loan which is specifically borrowed for the construction or acquisition of a qualifying asset only is called specific loan. Specific borrowing, ito yung inutang mo specifically for the construction and development of the qualifying assets, while general borrowing, when general borrowings are used, the amount of borrowing cost eligible for capitalization is obtained by applying a capitalization rate to the expenditure of that asset. Another are the borrowings of the entity that are outstanding during the period other than borrowings made specifically for the purpose of obtaining a qualifying asset. General borrowing, ito yung type of borrowing that can be used to other things. Hindi siya for a certain project lang. Pwede itong magamit pa for another project. For more details, here is Miss Biana to discuss the types of borrowing.
Computation of specific borrowing, general borrowing, and combined specific and general. First, we topic about the specific borrowing. Specific borrowing used solely for the reconstruction of qualifying asset. Qualifying asset, ito yung mga asset na matagal gawin or reconstruct. Like for example, building, mga kalsada, ganyan. Hindi siya buwan, kundi tayong itatagal bago ito matapos. Specific borrowing, ito yung inutang mo na walang ibang pagkagagastusan kundi yung sa pagpapagwala mo ng qualifying asset at walang mapupunta sa ibang bagay kundi dun lang. So, compute how to get the specific borrowing. First, principal amount of borrowing. Kunin mo lahat ng specific amount ng iyong borrowing kung magkano ang halaga ng iyong inutang. Then the second is the interest rate. Normally given siya. Imo-multiply mo lang siya sa principal amount ng borrowing to get the interest incurred. Investment income naman, ito yung umutang ka na di mo naman pa talaga gagamitin. Dahil di mo naman siya gagamitin, i-invest mo siya sa share para magkaroon ka ng dividend. Sa bonds, para magkaroon ka ng interest. Ininet mo yan para sa iyong interest, and that will be your borrowing cost for specific. Para mas malinaw, I give an example. Construction started on November 1, 2020, and the asset was MDC Company self-contracted, an asset for its own use completed on December 31, 2020. The company had 2 years, 19% loan of 600,000 specifically obtained to finance the asset's construction. Funds not yet needed during the construction were temporarily invested in the short-term debt securities yielding a 15,000 interest revenue. Solution, principal amount of the borrowing ay nagkakahalaga ng 600,000. Interest rate niya, 19%. Tulad ngayon sinabi ko kanina, normally given na siya sa problem minsan. I-multiply mo lang yung 600,000, multiply mo siya 19%, interest incurred is 114,000. Investment income, ililess mo siya. Ililess mo siya sa interest incurred mo, less the interest income, borrowing cost from specific, the total is 99%. Ganun lang kadali guys, ang specific borrowing. So, let's proceed naman sa general borrowing. General borrowing is for construction of qualifying asset and also used for other purposes. Ito is based on kung magkano yung ginastos mong pera. For example, meron kang 1 million, tapos yung 800,000 lang yung ginastos mo. Yun yung maituturing mong general mo. Yung 200,000, pwede mo siyang gamitin sa ibang bagay tulad ng pagpapasahod or the other purposes. To compute the general borrowing, first kukunin natin yung weighted average expenditure niya. I-multiply natin siya sa average interest rate para makuha natin yung borrowing cost from general. To get the weighted average expenditure per expenditure. Expenditure naman, ito yung halaga or kung magkano yung ginastos mo. I-multiply natin siya sa months of outstanding. Ito yung number of months kung gaano siya nagtagal, nawala sa'yo. I-divide natin siya sa months of construction. Yung months of construction naman is during the year, pero madalas 12 months siya. Para makuha natin yung weighted average expenditure. To get the average interest rate naman, ito yung annual interest of all general. Kukunin natin lahat or i-record natin lahat ng general. I-divide natin siya sa principal amount of general para makuha natin average interest rate. Yan, para mas malinaw, magbibigay ako ng example. On January 1, 2021, SMDC Company purchased a tract of land with an old building which was raised shortly after acquisition. But SMDC Company had the following borrowing were made for general purposes, but the proceeds were used in part of finance of construction of a new building. 15% bank loan. Principal, 15 million. Yung interest niya is 2,250,000. 20% long-term loan. Yung principal niya is 25 million. Yung interest niya is 5 million. Skip na lang natin guys yung PowerPoint. The construction began on January 1, 2021 and was completed on December 31, 2021. Expenditure building were as follows. On January 1, meron siyang 8 million. July 30, meron siyang 9 million. December 31, meron siyang 5 million. The question is, what amount of interest capitalized borrowing cost? Answer, weighted average expenditure is 11,750,000. Average interest rate, 18%. Tapos yung borrowing cost from general niya is 2,115,000. First, alamin natin kung paano nakuha yung weighted average expenditure. Ito yung solution niya. On January 1, meron siyang 8 million. I-multiply natin siya sa 12. I-divide natin siya sa 12 para nakuha yung 8 million. On July 30 naman, meron siyang 9 million. I-multiply natin siya sa 5 months. Divide natin siya sa 12. For the total of 3,750,000. Tapos on December 31 naman, meron siyang 5 million. Multiply natin siya sa 0. Divide 12. Kaya yung answer niya is 0. I-record natin siyang 0. Para nakuha natin, add lang natin yung 8 million plus 3,750,000 para makuha natin yung 11,750,000 na weighted average expenditure. Sa average interest rate naman, paano siya nakuha? So, ito. Yung interest na 2,250,000 plus 5 million equals 7,250,000. Tapos, 15 million, ito yung principal amount niya. 15 million plus 25 million equals 40 million. Ito yung 7,250,000, ito yung annual interest. Tapos, yung 40 million naman, ito yung tinatawag na principal amount. Yung gagawin lang natin, i-divide natin yung total niya para makuha natin yung average interest rate. Ito na siya, 7,250,000 divide 40 million equals 18%. Ganun lang kadali yun. So, i-record natin yung sagot, weighted average expenditure, 11,750,000. Average interest rate niya is 18%. Multiply lang natin yung dalawa, kaya nakuha yung 2,115,000 or yung tinatawag natin borrowing cost from general. So, let's proceed naman sa combined, specific, and general. Combined, specific, and general, which is asset, is financed by the specific borrowing. But a portion is used for working capital of general borrowing, determining the capitalized borrowing cost. To get the combined, specific, and general, first, kukunin natin yung weighted average expenditure. Dito, kukunin natin lahat yung ginastos, kung magkano yung expenditure, ang pininance ni general, kung magkano sa mga perang ginastos mo, ang kinuha mo doon sa inutang mo para sa general purposes. And the second naman is principal of specific borrowing. Ito, ililes natin siya. Lahat to ng specific borrowing para makuha natin yung total na expenditure finance by borrowing or yung pininance ng general borrowing. And then, average interest rate of general. Ito yung annual interest. I-divide natin siya sa principal interest ng lahat ng general para makuha natin yung borrowing cost from general. And then next naman, yung borrowing cost from specific. I-add natin yung dalawa, yung borrowing cost from general at yung borrowing cost from the specific para makuha natin yung total borrowing cost. Yan. I give an example. Elixir Company constructed an asset for its own use. Construction started on January 1, 2020 and the asset was completed on December 31, 2020. The company had a 2 years 20% loan of 700,000 specifically obtained to finance the asset construction. Funds not yet needed during the construction were temporarily invested in the short-term debt securities yielding a 15,000 interest revenue. The company also had a general borrowing amounting to 800,000, 6-year term with interest of 25% and 1,200,000, 11-year term with interest of 20% were used in part in the self-construction costs incurred during the year were as follows. On January 1, 500,000, April 1, 600,000, August 1, 480,000, and December 1, 180,000. The question is, what is average accumulated expenditure for the self-constructed asset? Number 2, how much is the total capitalized interest? So, ito yung magiging answer. Weighted average expenditure niya is nagkakahalaga ng 1,165,000. Principal of specific borrowing less 700,000. Expenditure financed by general borrowing 465,000. Tapos average interest rate of general 22%. Borrowing cost from general 102,300. Borrowing cost from specific is 125,000. Total borrowing cost niya is 227,300. First, alamin muna natin kung paano nakuha yung weighted average expenditure. Na-discuss ko na siya kanina sa general average. Ay, sa general borrowing pala. Ito yung solution. January 1, 500,000 times 12 months divide 12 equals 500,000. April 1, 600,000 times 9 months divide 12 equals 450,000. No August 1, 480,000 times 5 months divide 12 equals 200,000. December 1, 180,000 times 1 divide 12 equals 15,000. Ito total lang natin tong lahat para makuha yung weighted average expenditure niya. 500,000, 450,000, 200,000, 15,000 is equals to 1,165,000. Ito na yung weighted average expenditure niya. To compute naman the average interest rate of general, ito yung 800,000 times 25% equals 200,000. 1,200,000 times 20% equals to 40,000. 200 plus 240,000 equals 440,000. Tapos 440,000 divide 2 million is equals to 22%. Ito na yung average interest rate niya, 22%. Tapos, yung solution to compute the specific naman, na-topic na natin siya sa specific borrowing. Ito yung kukunin natin yung principal amount. Yung principal amount niya is 700,000, tapos yung interest rate niya is 20,000. Interest incurred niya is 140,000. Investment income, ililess natin siya ng 15,000. Borrowing cost from specific is 125,000. Normally given na talaga siya. So, ayun guys.
Hey, so what I'm going to discuss to you is about specific borrowing for asset used for general purposes, period of capitalization, and disclosures related to borrowing cost. So kanina, someone discussed about specific and general borrowing itself. But now, I am going to discuss specific borrowing for asset used for general purposes. And I know it's really confusing talaga, but to clear things up to you, here it is. Specific borrowing for asset used for general purposes. If the asset is financed by specific borrowing but a portion is used for working capital purposes, the borrowing shall be treated as general borrowing in determining capitalizable borrowing cost. So, ang ibig lang niyan sabihin, if ang asset is financed by specific borrowing but meron pa ring portion na ginamit for working capital purposes, that borrowing shall be treated as general borrowing in determining capitalizable borrowing cost. Parang kanina lang din. Thus, capitalizable borrowing cost is equal to the average expenditure on the asset multiplied by the interest rate. Para makuha yung capitalizable borrowing cost, i-multiply mo lang yung average expenditure on the asset and yung average interest rate. Next is period of capitalization. Commencement of capitalization. All activities necessary to prepare the asset for its intended use or sale in progress. For the capitalization of borrowing costs as part of the cost of qualifying asset to commence, or meaning ng commence is to arise, the following three conditions must be present. So, first is when the entity incurs expenditure for the asset o yung kung ang entity ay nag-incur ng expenditure para sa asset. Second is when the entity incurs borrowing cost. So, obviously, borrowing cost ang topic natin. So, kailangan ng entity mag-incur ng borrowing cost. Third is when the entity undertakes activities that are necessary to prepare the asset for the intended use or sale. O ito yung mga activities that includes technical and administrative work o yung mga drawing up plans para sa commencement of physical construction o para mag-arise yung physical construction. However, holding assets for use or development without any associated development activity, obviously, it does not qualify for capitalization kasi without any associated development yung commencement ang balak, ang aim niya is to arise or to commence, So, next is suspension of capitalization. An entity may incur borrowing costs during extended periods in which it suspends the activities necessary to prepare the asset for its intended use or sale, and that such costs are cost of holding partially completed assets and do not qualify for capitalization. So, it only means that ang entity shall only suspend capitalization of borrowing costs during extended periods, in which it suspends active development of qualifying asset. So, next is the cessation of capitalization or ito yung sinasabing ending of capitalization of borrowing cost. So, cessation of capitalization. If an asset has been completed in parts and a completed part is capable of being used while the construction for the other part continues, then the capitalization for that completed part will cease. So, capitalization of borrowing cost ceases when all the activities necessary to prepare the qualifying assets are complete. O ito yung kompleto na. Another information to remember na nakalagay naman dyan sa slide is that if an asset has been completed in part, which is capable of being used naman, while the construction for the other part continues, then the capitalization for that completed part will cease. Just for example, when a business part consists of several buildings and each building can be treated as an individual part. Another example of cessation of capitalization is when you rent an apartment na nasa building and the other part of the apartment of the building is in construction, but you still manage to live there. That place you live for is the completed part that will cease, but the other part of the building or the apartment shall continue to construct. And that is the cessation of capitalization. Next is the disclosures related to borrowing cost. A. The amount of borrowing cost capitalized during the period. B. The capitalization rate used for that used to determine the amount of borrowing cost eligible for capitalization. Segregation of assets that are qualifying assets from other assets in the statement of financial position is not required to be disclosed.